America is pausing this weekend to remember the victims of the 9/11 attacks. It's been 15 years since planes crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. President George W. Bush was sitting in front of a group of students at an elementary school in Florida that September morning. His chief of staff, Andrew Card, was the one person who whispered into his ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." Andrew Card joins me now from Washington, D.C. Mr. Card, before we get into everything else, I want to ask if you've had a chance to tour the 9/11 Museum and what your thoughts are.
I did tour the 9/11 Museum, and I did it without identifying myself. I wanted to just walk through as any tourist coming to New York City, and I found the experience to be unbelievably moving. It was also a good way for us to keep our promise that we would never forget. So I remembered a lot that day. I appreciated that there were tremendous sacrifices made by EMS workers and firefighters and police officers. I remember the tragedy of losing so many truly innocent people that day, almost 3,000 people. But visiting that museum is important, and everyone should do it, whether they were connected to 9/11 or not. I would say the same thing about the memorial in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and also the one outside the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. or in Northern Virginia. And I'd also recommend visiting the Presidential Museum for George W. Bush in Dallas, Texas. It's great ways to remember the reality of that day and the trauma that we faced, but also the resolve and the unity that came in its aftermath.
Let's talk about that day. How did you decide to interrupt the president's event at that Sarasota elementary school?
Well, just before the president had walked into the classroom, he had been told, and I was standing next to him, he had been told by the director of the White House Situation Room, a woman by the name of Deb Lauer, that it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City. We all reacted the same way. Oh, what a horrible accident. The pilot must have had a heart attack or something. And then the principal of the school opened the door and the president walked into the classroom with the principal. I was left standing at the door when the door was shut, and then Captain Lauer came up to me and said, "Sir, it appears it was not a small twin-engine prop plane, but a commercial jetliner." My mind flashed to the fear that the passengers on the plane must have experienced, but that was a nanosecond because Deb Lauer came right back up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center." I stood at the door and I passed a test that chiefs of staff have to pass many times during a day. Does the president need to know? The answer is yes, obviously. I made a conscious decision to pass on two facts, make one editorial comment. I thought about what I would say. I didn't want to do anything to invite a question or start a dialogue. So I walked into the room. The president was in the middle of a dialogue with the students. I didn't want to interrupt that. When that dialogue finished and the teacher told the students to take out their books because they were going to read with the president, that's when I walked up to the president, leaned over and whispered, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." I stood back from him so he couldn't ask me a question or start a dialogue. And I was impressed with how he did nothing to introduce fear to those very young students. He did nothing to demonstrate the fear to the media that would have translated to the satisfaction of the terrorists around the world. But I was also pleased that he probably contemplated his responsibility, which is awesome. His job as president is to keep his oath, and that calls for him to preserve, protect, and defend. And I believe that was the day he realized what the real job of being president was. And I was pleased with how he reacted. I was also grateful that he stayed in that room and allowed me to get ready for people to help him. So I went into the holding room and I said, "Get the FBI director on the phone, get a line open to the vice president, get a line open to the White House Situation Room, get the crew back on Air Force One, get the Secret Service ready to depart the school." And to the communications team, I said, "Get some remarks written because we've got 600 people in the gymnasium and the president's going to have to say something to him, but he can't say anything we do not know to be the truth." So that was the message. I knew I was delivering an important message, a very rare message in a phenomenally rare environment where you couldn't really talk about it. And I realized that this was an act of war perpetrated against the United States, and the president would have to meet his awesome responsibilities, not only as president, but also as commander-in-chief.
There was a bit of miscommunication aboard Air Force One. According to former press secretary Ari Fleischer, someone was heard saying, and I'm quoting here, "Angel is next." Angel is actually the code word for Air Force One at the time. There were concerns that Air Force One was being targeted. Did you think at the time that you could potentially be shot down?
We did. The fog of war is very real, and the fog clearly had descended on everybody, including the White House staff. And yes, we did hear reports that the code word for Air Force One, Angel, had been used, so there was some fear that someone may be sitting right near the runway in Sarasota, Florida, with a Stinger missile, and that Air Force One might be a target. So we were very anxious not to have a target hit us, and we were anxious to get the president in the air where he could be safe and have relatively good communications and meet his responsibilities. But it was a tense day, and the fog of war caused a lot of us to question things, and there was a degree of paranoia. I tried to be very cool, calm, and collected and help the president do his job, and we had great support from everybody on Air Force One. So the president surrounded himself with excellent people who were meeting a responsibility to help him meet his responsibility.
And ultimately, the president decided to authorize the shoot-down of unidentified planes. How did he come to that decision?
Well, I was sitting right across from the president at his desk in the nose of Air Force One when he was on the phone with the vice president, and the vice president asked if the president would authorize our fighter jets to shoot down commercial jetliners. I didn't hear the vice president's side of the conversation. I clearly heard the president's side of the conversation. And I remember after he gave that authorization and he hung up the phone, he leaned across the table and said to me, "I can't believe what I just authorized. I was a pilot in the Air Force. I would have been one of the people getting that order, and I can't imagine receiving that order as a young pilot flying a plane." So I was very impressed that the president had empathy for the strange order that he had authorized and the reality of what it takes to be a commander-in-chief and call on people to meet their obligations who serve in the military. After all, they take an oath to follow the commander of the commander-in-chief. Right after that, we learned that Flight 93 had crashed into Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And I will admit, there were some of us on the plane that wondered if that plane had gone down because one of our fighter jets had shot a missile at it. So yes, it was a very, very serious way to understand the responsibilities that the president was trying to meet and the nature of the attack on the United States that day.
When did you realize that al-Qaeda was behind downing of the two towers?
Candidly, as soon as Captain Deb Lauer told me, "Oh my gosh, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center," my initial reaction was UBL. That's what we called Osama bin Laden. And I knew about al-Qaeda. I knew about the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1992.
So, Mr. Card, you felt right away that this was al-Qaeda behind the 9/11 attacks?
I did, and it was confirmed once we got to the Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska, where we were in a bunker in deep underground, and we had a National Security Council meeting, and George Tenet said that it appears that this was done by al-Qaeda. So I was not surprised that he said that. It was kind of, for me, obvious. I had expected it, but I remember George Tenet confirming that when the group was meeting by secure video conference while we were working our way back to Washington, D.C.
And that was the same day of 9/11. You knew instantly.
It was. It was first the president and his entourage flew to Barksdale Air Force Base from Florida, and then we trimmed the number of people on Air Force One down, and we took off and went to Omaha, Nebraska. The Strategic Air Command went into a deep bunker where the president had a secure video conference with the national security team, and then we went back to Washington, D.C., and he arrived at the White House and then went right into the Oval Office and got ready to address the American people, and then we had a National Security Council meeting in the bunker underneath the White House.
What were some of the first lines of defense that the White House thought about at the time to go against al-Qaeda?
Well, I have to give Secretary of Transportation at the time, Norm Mineta, tremendous credit for helping to direct all of the planes that were in the air to go to the ground and not to be in the air anymore. And I want to give credit to the Canadians that accepted many of those planes. In fact, I just saw a fabulous musical called Come From Away that is about the Canadians accepting all of those planes on September 11th and demonstrating phenomenal compassion for Americans and everybody else who was was on those planes heading to the United States. But the first action was really to get planes out of the sky so that if there were any danger, we would know about it on those planes and prevent those planes from being used as weapons of mass destruction, but also get people out of harm's way. So that was the first act. Of course, the first act in the war on terror that required tremendous sacrifice was the act of the passengers on Flight 93, the plane where the passengers charged the cockpit and caused that plane not to hit its probable target of either the Capitol or the White House in Washington, D.C., but instead be driven into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And those civilian heroes, the first heroes in the war on terror, deserve to be recognized, and they have been, and we're very grateful to them. That's why I don't want people to forget the sacrifices that were made that day.
I want to ask you about Donald Trump's criticism of President Bush, that 9/11, according to him, was President Bush's fault. What would you say to Trump?
That is absurd. I found it offensive, and I didn't find it as if he had done any homework at all. So I was offended by his comments about that. Look, I was with President Bush that entire day. I was kind of Velcroed to him. And we had very, very candid and conversations, and the president had to meet awesome responsibilities. I watched him make decisions where people did not advise him, but he had the judgment to exercise the right thing to do. For example, he called President Putin and said, please do not overreact. We're not going to war with you. This is not an excuse for you to go on high alert or to send missiles toward the United States. And I thought that was a remarkable thing for the president to do, because nobody asked him to do it. He just thought that he should do it. But I was also very impressed with how he exercised responsible leadership that was not emotionally driven, but instead very consciously considered as what the right thing to do. And he was very anxious to make sure that any other attacks were going to be thwarted and that we'd do everything to prevent any future attacks.
Is it significant that neither President Bush, either the first or George W. Bush, has endorsed Donald Trump? Does that say something about the state of the Republican Party?
Well, the Republican Party has been strained. After all, we had a very active primary contest, and Jeb Bush was my favorite candidate, and I supported him, and a lot of other people did. And I don't think Donald Trump gave enough respect to not only Jeb Bush, but all of the other candidates that were in the primary contest, and there were a lot of them. But I do think it's important for Republicans to come together to support a ticket, especially down ticket, that is critical to making sure that there at least is a good, solid contingent of Republicans in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. And I know both President Bushes are very supportive of the Republicans who are running down ticket. And yes, they do have some questions about Donald Trump.
The war on terror looks so much differently than it did 15 years ago. What do you make of how the Obama administration has handled ISIS? Should they have done anything differently?
I do second guess some of the decisions President Obama has made. I wish that we had had an agreement so that we could maintain more force protection in Iraq. I think that would have helped to discourage the creation of ISIL or ISIS. I do think that having the resolve to say we were not going to allow Bashir Assad to cross a red line, and once he crossed it, we didn't do anything about it. So I do question some of his policy. But look, every president wants to keep their oath, and the primary obligation is to prevent the next attack today, because the threat from terrorists is real. And understand that the terrorist organizations that threaten the United States today are very different than a lot of the threats that presidents had to deal with over history. Most of the threats that came from outside the United States were threats coming from nation states, where there were rules and people, you could argue, we're going to find a table to argue over, to sit and argue over whether or not there should be a peace. We're dealing with terrorists who aren't in a position to show up at a table and negotiate a solution. So we play by the rules, the terrorists do not, and it's a very different challenge. But there is a war on terror going on, and it's incumbent that the president lead the war on terror, recognize that it's a war on terror, and build as many alliances with our partners around the world as possible.
And finally, Mr. Card, there's an entire generation now that has no memory of 9/11. What do you want them to know about that day?
I want them to study history. History is very important. We do learn from history, and we want to learn things from history that we should not repeat. I would encourage everyone to visit the museum in New York City, the 9/11 Memorial, visit Shanksville, Pennsylvania, visit the Pentagon, visit the Bush Library, visit in Oklahoma where Tommy Franks has an exhibit that opens this weekend on telling us not to forget 9/11. There are lots of places where students who were not born when 9/11 happened can learn about what happened. I would like people to understand not just the timeline and the history of the event, but somehow be able to, through some mechanism, be able to recognize the emotional roller coaster and concern that everybody had in the United States that day. And we came together as a country in a remarkable way. We were also very suspect even of each other. So there was an underlying fear, but an overwhelming unity, and that unity ended up dominating as we were able to pull the country together to do things that brought people together even though they had different philosophical views, different partisan views. And the immediate aftermath of September 11th, 2001 had President Bush leading a very United States of America. And that was after he had been elected president in a very controversial way, kind of by the Supreme Court. And so it can happen, it did happen, and it did make a difference.
Andrew Card, former Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.